Good afternoon, you guys. Thanks, Jacob, and then Associated Students for having me out. And then thank all of you for coming out and listening to my talk today. It is way nicer here than it is in Nebraska. We were still having snow last week, and I couldn't get my students to come to class. So the fact that you guys are all here, I'm super excited about and thankful for. So today I'm going to be talking about the role that implicit attitudes and implicit associations have in the pre-K through 12th grade education system. Right. So as an education researcher, I get asked a lot, like, what does that mean? Particularly from my dad, who doesn't quite understand like what education research is, right? He still thinks I'm going to go and teach high school. So I was thinking about this a lot, and when I was flying out here, I was actually sitting next to someone, and I said, oh, I'm an education researcher, and they said, well, what do you do? I was like, well, we should probably have one go-to sentence for what it is that education research is. So I thought about that a little bit, and I said, I study the characteristics that are related to student outcomes. Real simple sentence. And for me, those characteristics have a lot to do with attitudes, right? So the attitudes of students, teachers, and parents, and the way that those attitudes play out for student growth and development. And I'm not talking about this kind of attitude, right? Although we see a lot of this, particularly if you're going into adolescent education. Oops. What I'm talking about is attitude from the psychology framework or context, right? So the evaluations that a person has about others, about objects, about ideas and behaviors. And when I'm talking about attitudes, I'm talking about it from three different components, right? So there's the affective component of it, the emotion that we have towards an object. So if we're talking about myself, I'll use snakes for example. I am afraid of snakes. That's my affective response to an object. Right? There's a behavioral component to this, or the way that we act because of this attitude. So if I see a snake when I'm out on my run, I'm going to jump out of the way, probably make some startled sound, and hope that somebody will take care of it for me, or that it'll just go away. Right? And then there's this cognitive component to it. So the ideas and beliefs that we have about the object that we're evaluating. So for me, I know that snakes are dangerous because I watched too much, Animal Planet growing up. Right? These are all attitudes and how we frame attitudes from the psych aspect. When we're talking about research, though, there are two ways that we can go about actually measuring these attitudes. So we can be real direct. We can use explicit measures and use things like Likert scales or the semantic differential scale and actually ask someone how they feel about a particular thing. So if we're talking about students, we can give them a Likert scale and say, how much do you like your math class or something like that. But the problem with our explicit measures is that people can go about editing their responses. And this is particularly the case when we're talking about socially undesirable characteristics and socially undesirable topics. So I don't mean they're actually going in and changing it from a 7 to a 4 kind of thing. I mean, before they actually even respond to the question, there's a bit of processing that goes on in our mind, and we're maybe reducing how extremely we feel about something. And one way that this plays out that I've seen is when we're talking to kids about bullying, right? They'll say that either they haven't been bullied or the extent to which that they've been bullied is not that severe because there's a stigmatization towards being a victim that they don't want to be associated with. Or another great example from the family development and family sciences space is spanking your children, right? Do you spank your children? It's not socially desirable to say that you do that. So a lot of parents will say no, even if it's something that they actually do. So if we're interested in measuring these attitudes and we think there's something unique and innovative about these attitudes that relate to the outcomes of students, we can be a little bit more innovative. And we can use a more implicit approach to measuring the topics of interest. And this is where my work falls into. And some examples of this are like reaction time measures. So if you've ever taken the implicit association test or the IAT, that's an example of an implicit measure. Evaluative priming is another example of this. Right? We can use physiological measures. We can put people into an MRI and actually measure their brain activity. We can measure people's heart rates. Right? We can take cortisol levels. So we can actually swipe the inside of someone's cheek and measure the amount of hormones they're being emitted when they're stressed or not. We can use eye tracking. So a cool example of this is if we're interested in how a teacher feels about particular types of students, so boys or girls in a classroom, we can have them wear these funky glasses, kind of like Google Glass. I don't know if those are actually a thing in the development, but they wear these cool glasses, and we actually measure how long someone's going to be teachers would look at a particular student, right? So they look at their boys a little bit longer when they think problematic behavior is going to happen than when they're looking at their girls, right? And because these things are measuring below like the conscious awareness of the individual, they're measured without the ability to be edited, right? It's harder to tweak these things because they're happening below our awareness. It's all well and good, right? This is great. We could talk about the way that we develop these measures and how these measures work for a while, but you guys are all in the field of education. You're probably not all that interested in the implicit stuff and how they work. So I'm going to apply this in the education context and talk about a mock example that we might be interested in, how you guys could use an implicit measure in that scenario, then also dive into my work a little bit to see how these things are playing out. So let's say, for example, you were interested in the way that teachers' attitudes about race or gender impact the development of students, right? And let's use the race example for this one. The modern prejudice scale is an explicit measure, so we're directly asking these things to teachers to get at the levels of prejudice and bias in a school environment, right? So you can see that it's a Likert scale. They're going from strongly disagree to strongly agree, and there are like 11 or so questions, and I just picked 3 of them out to give an example. So black students are getting too demanding for their push for equal rights. Right? Prejudice against black students is not a problem in my school. It is not my role as a teacher to make any special effort to help black students because they should help themselves. Right? These are really, really charged questions. And the work that I've done with teachers in the Nebraska school systems, I can tell you that we'll see a lot of 1s and 2s over here. Right? There aren't going to be that many teachers that are going to say students are getting too demanding in their push for equal rights, or that prejudice is a problem. They strongly agree that that's a case going on there, because it says something about them as educators, right? It's going to say something about the way that they teach and the beliefs that they have, and people are afraid of being called prejudiced, right? That's not something that we want to be told about ourselves. So, and if this were the case and we got all these low levels here, things would be looking like they're going fairly well for our students of color, right? That maybe in the school district, we're not actually having some of the problems that we see when we talk about disproportionate educational access. But we know that's not the case. And I'm not talking about just the black-white gap in education. I'm talking about things that are directly related to the attitudes and perceptions of teachers that we know from previous research doesn't necessarily line up with this idea that everything is okay and good. So we know that teachers have lower expectations for their students of color compared to their white peers. Right? We know that teachers will treat students differently even when academic abilities are the same. We know that there's going to be a difference in overall referral and representation in special education. Right? There's disproportionate rates of school discipline and how that discipline is being administered. And we know from some of my work that there's differences in the way that teachers actually perceive conflict and closeness as far as student-teacher relationships are concerned. And this is happening all the way down in the kindergarten level. Like the fall of kindergarten, teachers haven't even had their students in class for more than 2 weeks. And we know that these differences are occurring. So there's something going on that's happening, at least in the way teachers are perceiving their students in the classroom environment, that we're not picking up from these explicit measures. So when I talk about this with my students, the conversation immediately goes to race and racism, right? And that's not necessarily what's happening there. Or it'll go to sexism and gender when we're talking about it in that context. And that's not quite what's happening. What we're trying to say here is that we have these implicit associations, right? These attitudes that are happening automatically, they're happening without intention, and they're happening outside of our conscious awareness that are driving the way that we behave, or at least think about the people that we're working and interacting with. Even if it's not necessarily going to an actual behavior where we're treating a student different, it's going to make us pause a little bit and think about what's happening, or get a little bit more cautious. So these implicit attitudes are something that I'm really interested in studying and learning more about. How they develop, where they come from, what do they mean for our students as they go through the K-12 and the preschool process. So we're going to dive into my work just a little bit here. So one study that I worked on, I was interested in looking at the way that implicit bias actually affects the way teachers are perceiving their students. So what I did here is I got a national representative sample of teachers. So I got teachers from all over the US, and they filled out a survey, and I wanted to kind of control it as much as I can. So what happened was they were randomly assigned to one of 4 different groups of vignettes, right, or stories that are depicting a student telling us what's going on. And the vignettes were cool in that I took all of the children that were born in 2011. I looked at what names were given to them through Social Security data, right, for their first name, and I found the most stereotypical black, white, male, and female names given to kids in 2011, which at the time of my study, those would have been kids that were in kindergarten at that time, right? And I was looking at elementary school teachers. So they should be pretty familiar with these names. These names should give them some kind of idea of what the student's going to look like and maybe how they relate to students that are like them in the classroom. So they were sorted into the white male that was typically behaving, so they were behaving well, they weren't causing any problems kind of thing in one vignette, and the one that was coupled with that was a black male who was disruptive. And the set 2 was the black male was the typically acting student, and then the white male was the one that was disruptive, and this continued with females too. So I had 4 groups here. And what the teachers did is they read these vignettes, and then they were followed up with questions that said, like, how would you intervene with this student? Like, would you act at all? Would you call home? Would you talk to the parent? Would you send them down to the principal's office for this behavior? Do you think this behavior will affect their academic outcomes in your classroom? And how do you expect the relationship quality of you and the student to be given the school year? And my reason for doing this, because I've had people that said, well, why didn't you actually go in, or these weren't their real students? The thought that I was having is when teachers get their list of kids over the summer of who's going to be in their classroom, they just see the names. And they're starting to already create this idea, at least in their head, of how the following year is going to be. Do they have a lot of boys? Is it going to be a little bit more rowdy? Right? Are the names of minority students, and they think they're going to have to focus on certain areas a little bit more when they're prepping their courses, et cetera, et cetera. Right? And I also gave teachers an IAT, so that implicit association test, so I could see where their preferences fell. Right? And then an idea of their self-efficacy of teaching, how confident they are in their teaching abilities. And what I found is that teachers were less tolerant of black students' disruptive behavior. So even though that the vignettes were all the same, we only changed the name kind of thing, teachers, even in the typically behaved child, teachers were more likely to be concerned about the black student compared to the white student. We also found that they were more likely to be worried about and angry when boys were acting out compared to girls. For whatever reason, they felt they had to intervene, they had to call home, they had to seek extra help and support for their boys compared to their girls. And we also found that there was a fairly strong pro-white attitude with the IAT. So that was interesting there. We found there was a relationship between the IAT scores and then this ability to feel they have to intervene, provide support, and discipline students of color. So the race field and the gender in education is something that is pretty well established with implicit measures. So I wanted to diversify it up a little bit, and I wanted to say we can use these implicit frameworks in ways outside of just talking about bias, because it gets a little tiring on you personally when you're talking about what people say are racism and sexism all the time. So I thought, okay, let's do something a little bit different, let's step back. And I jumped on to a bullying project. And I was interested in looking at the way students who are victims of bullying see their peers as threatening or a source of security compared to those who are not victims of bullying that self-identify. And as you saw the animations playing out, the way that this works is this is another implicit association test, and the kids have to sort various different words. So they have to sort peer words like friends, classmates, students, and they also have to sort words like happy or friendly into the safety category, and then things like angry and mean into threat. And we found that students that were victimized and are being bullied in our bullying intervention have a more threatening view of their peers compared to the students who aren't. But when we give them an actual measure or survey about this, we didn't see any differences between the victimized and non-victimized groups, right? So something about the implicit category or the implicit measure captured something different than the explicit. So the third study that I'm working on, which is actually going to be my dissertation, is looking at the way social attitudes develop in preschool children. So we know that as young as 3 months old, kids are going to have a like-me preference. So people that look like them, they're going to have a more positive association for. Where people that are different, they're a little bit more reserved. They show behaviors where they're timid, etc. And by the age of 6 or 7, kids will actually display like prejudice behaviors where they're being mean to students that are different than them. Boys are being mean to girls, white students are being mean to students of color, etc. So I was interested in figuring out what's happening in that 3-year-old to 5-year-old range, those preschool years, that are translating into later prejudice behavior. Like, where is this coming from? How is this developing? And the National Association for the Education of Young Children, or NAEYC, in 2010, they came out with a curriculum that they called the anti-bias curriculum with the intentions of actually going forward and creating classroom environments that are less biased, because they saw this as a problem. Right? The thing, though, is since 2010, we haven't really evaluated that curriculum. And even if we aren't going into this full anti-bias space, there's a multicultural curriculums, there's cultural competency. There are a lot of things that we're doing at the classroom level to try to reduce bias. But this isn't, the measures that we have now for this aren't actually developmentally appropriate for those younger years, so for those 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. So what I'm working on with the Social Attitudes in Toddlers Assessment, or SANTA, is a game that kids are going to play that actually look at the preference that they have for black or white characters, right? So tapping into this implicit thing, these implicit attitudes that they have on race, how is that impacting their behavior? And are these different classroom pedagogies that we're teaching actually reducing the bias for our children that are going through them? So the animation went a little bit fast. Let's see if I go back and play. But the way that it works is the character is going to flash really quickly, and then a present or a piece of coal will pop up on the screen, and the kids know that they have to sort them into either the naughty or the nice list, right? They're helping Santa deliver presents is the premise of the game, and kids get really excited about this. And what we're measuring on the back end of the game, how long it takes them to place the present into the nice pile and place the coal into the naughty pile. And what we're seeing is depending on which character they're being presented with, even though it's really quick and they're not really processing what's going on, we're getting differences in the amount of time that it takes them to sort them into the 2 categories, which is how we're getting at our implicit preferences and associations. Right, so there's something happening there that even at 3, and even when they're not seeing the characters and interacting with them, that there are differences that are occurring in their ability to sort present into nice, coal into this naughty space. And this is happening for all of our students, which is interesting, even our students of color. So there's something happening there and something going on that's triggering this implicit space and idea. So why is this important, right? Why do we care? Why would I want to measure this at 3? Why would you want to tap into these implicit measures and put them into your work? We know that the way attitudes develop, because there's this cognitive component to it, this behavioral component to it, that it's very cyclical. Right? So we develop some kind of attitude. If we're talking about bias and inequality here, we have these negative attitudes and these behaviors that we create, right? We create memories about these negative things that we see, and we create a more negative implicit attitude and association. If these attitudes are acted on enough, the way that we behave and treat others can actually become different. It could develop into some kind of prejudice or stereotyping. Right? If we act on those prejudice beliefs, it becomes discrimination, right? Which reinforces this inequality, which brings us right back, and the process happens over and over again. This implicit component is actually energizing a more widespread inequality in our schools. So if we're talking about race and gender differences, we see that happening here. And by understanding these causes and pushing back on them, right, if we know what kind of interventions are working to reduce these implicit beliefs, make them more positive or neutral, we can actually reduce the cyclical process. Right? We can intervene early in the case of my preschoolers and not have to try to do it when they're adults later on, which is where we see a lot of this intervention work happening in the workplace and later on in life, right? Why not get them when they're young and not have this actually be a bias that's developed later on? So I have no idea how I did on time. Well, not bad, right? 20 minutes. So I threw a lot of stuff at you guys. I think we have like 5 minutes or so for questions. Right, I tried to cover the gamut here, but I'm happy to answer those and then obviously chat after if you want to do that.
I have a question. So
yes.
You mentioned that there's differences in the time that students are responding to Nicole and
yep.
based on race of the character?
Yeah.
Is there any difference? Have you found any difference or looked at? Is there a difference between whether they're assigning Cole or presence based on race?
So haven't dug into. We don't have a huge sample yet. It's one of the things I'm going to look at. But the way that that priming measure works is if it's incorrect, we toss them out. Right? So we aren't looking at it and saying, okay, they see the black character and they're giving all the black characters Cole, because anything that's not correct gets removed before we do the analysis and the time. One thing that is interesting, though, is I thought it was going to be a like me kind of thing. So white students would be faster at identifying the correct answer for white. Black students would be faster at identifying for black children, but it's not the case. It actually seems to be more of like a high status kind of thing. So this idea of every time they see the white character, it's faster than the neutral. When they see the character of color, it's actually slower. It takes them more time to process what's going on. Don't have a big enough sample yet to actually break out and see what does a time look like for sorting the presence. Is that always faster for the white children kind of thing? But hopefully after I get all of my kiddos, I'll be able to do that. Yeah.
What kinds of interventions that you would actually use for preschoolers?
Yeah, so they're all on the curriculum aspect right now, so actually changing the way that we're teaching things to be more inclusive. So the 3 that are like the common go-tos are the idea of like, we'll just have posters and books and songs and toys that are diverse, right? They represent different cultures, but we won't explicitly teach on that. That's like just the availability representation kind of approach. When you go into multicultural ed, it's where you'll teach and celebrate different holidays and start to incorporate that into the learning environment so they get it over the course of the school year. When you go one step higher and you use NACCE's anti-bias approach, it's actually teaching kids, it's like correcting bad behavior, right? So if they are picking on someone, you correct that, or if they make a comment about, like girls can't play with superheroes kind of thing, you actually intervene and correct that behavior and curb it. It's kind of like one step above just teaching that there are differences for people. There aren't necessarily like real short interventions in the same way that we use them for adults. We bake it into the curriculum so they're exposed to it over and over again. The idea being that if they do a 3, 4, 5 preschool, they'll get it for 3 years and hopefully it'll work. But again, there hasn't been a ton, at least in the anti-bias curriculum approach, done at actually looking if that's working. It's mainly because of the measurement. We don't have a way to measure if it's impacting bias yet, right? And hopefully that's where the dissertation will come in and be useful. But yeah.
Going back to your teacher expectations.
Yep.
I have a study that I'm working on that finds that teachers have higher expectations for the whole class.
Mm-hmm.
When there are kids with emotional disabilities in that room. So the teacher sees everyone as needing to step up to the plate emotionally.
Yeah.
How does that fit in with the theories that you've been researching with regards to teachers?
Yeah, so if I'm getting it correct, so when they have students that have an emotional need because of some kind of disability, they're actually raising the bar for everyone else.
For everyone, yeah, in the whole room.
Interesting. So with, I guess the downfalls of Nebraska is when I get students of color in the classroom, there's like 2, maybe. So I don't know if that's actually happening. Usually what will happen is the teacher will go over and for those particular students will either give them a ton of extra support or just kind of like back off and assume they're just not able to do what's going on, so we'll focus on everyone else. It'd be interesting to see if it's a little bit more mixed though, if we would have the same like fluctuation happening. It's interesting though. I wouldn't have expected that they would have raised the whole bar for everyone. That's cool. Yeah.
You're saying that the kids pick somebody with like a higher status?
Mm-hmm.
So does that mean that even like
Yep, so it's white male is usually the high status that they're seeing in the context of like good and more favorable. And that's been seen quite a bit through the literature, particularly with young children in the elementary range. It's this high status ability that they're seen as more positive, which is kind of like crappy, right? Like that's not what we want to see. We want students to see themselves and also others, but really see themselves as like being able and being positive and things like that. But we see more of this power thing going on, this high status. Yeah. Yep.
Are the images cartoons or the actual photos?
Nope, they're actually these cartoons. So with the 3 and 4-year-olds, it's getting, I'm digging into it a little bit more with the 5-year-olds. I'm actually going to use pictures of actual children. But with the 3 and 4-year-olds, like from cognitive standpoint, the reality versus not is not something we have to worry about. So they can feed, like the cartoon characters would work in the same way as using actual pictures of children. And so for boys only get the boy characters, and then girls only get the girls. Try to remove any kind of like gender bias that may be happening there. But even with the green, the blue and the green, when we did some like qualitative checks before we ran everything, they didn't think it was weird to have people with blue or green skin, which was kind of interesting and cool. They were like indifferent to them. We asked them to also identify if they would play, like of these friends, which 2 friends would you play with? And it usually ended up being matched by race or matching their friend group. And then we asked them to name the children, and they had a really hard time naming the green and blue children too. That usually matched their race also, or just like some random name when we asked them why they picked that. They're like, I don't know, I picked it. Where with everyone else, it was, oh, I have a friend named Devon, or oh, I have a friend named Charlotte, kind of thing, where they were associating kind of actually putting those characters onto an individual that they interact with.
So this is super tiny, but it might matter. Like the 2 white kids are taller and bigger than the 2 African Americans.
So when they show up, they aren't. Yeah, they're the same size in all of them. I guess they are taller here. That was me doing like sloppy PowerPoint dragging in, but no, they're the same size pixels.
I feel like height is a big status kind of thing.
Yeah,
Because that is completely perfectly correlated with age, at least.
yeah, definitely. And they also only get 1 at a time, right? So they would have to remember if they like picked up on that size difference anyway. Yep.
I think that them having different shirt colors might affect it also, just because they're very, their favorite colors they might
Yeah.
be biased towards.
So when I move up to actually doing this with a full sample and not just one preschool kind of thing, I'm going to give them all yellow shirts just to see if there are any differences there. But with the piloting, I haven't done that yet. I think yellow's the color that I'll go with. Definitely no blue, no pink kind of thing. It'll either be the yellow or the green shirt, and they're actually all going to get the same shirt when we go through and get these redesigned.
With kids this young, do you have the capacity to vary all of these different attributes? So like having a white guy with black hair versus blonde hair, I mean like, I feel like that might add some validity. I don't know their attention span, so I don't know if you have the ability to do this or not.
Yeah, I haven't thought about changing hair color at all.
I mean like
But it's definitely
everything,
something-
I don't know, just
yeah.
to sort of justify.
No, yeah, definitely something to look into. Yep.
The study that you talked about with teachers that you put names, what were the names?
So, yeah, so Jackson, Charlotte, Devon, and Aaliyah were the names that came up. And the way that we went about picking those names were actually from business HR research, where they, if you've ever heard of studies where they'll send out like thousands of applications and only change the name kind of thing. We use, it's called the Blackness Name Index, that you do that and you calculate all the names that were assigned and the likelihood that they were assigned to a specific gender and race. So we did that with the 2011 Social Security data for those.
I ask because it's one of the criticisms of that literature
Yeah.
itself is that names also indicate social status.
Mhm.
So Charleston versus Billy Ray.
Yeah.
Both be a white kid, but convey something very different.
Yeah,
So I was curious for the answer.
yeah, not something I dove into, but yeah.
Is there a reason all the girls don't have pigtails? Like, I feel like, especially as a young girl, like, they like to play with their hair and stuff like that. And she's the only one without pigtails.
Yeah, so she had a flower before, in her hair. And with the flower, they got super distracted by it, so we just took it off. But as far as like norms, we could add the pigtails. They would have to look a little bit different though. But yeah, that's something definitely to think about.
Okay,
Cool.
so as you can tell, we are running out of time and we need to make room for our next speaker. So thank you, Colin.
Yep.